Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. Okay, so this episode kind of resolves a bit of a conflict from last episode about how the gang broke up because it because this episode kind of forces them into a situation where they have to solve mysteries again, and the spoiler alert, they get back together by the end of the episode and are solving mysteries again. But this episode is mainly interesting in the fact that it spoofs H.P. Lovecraft, which is and it's kind of really funny in that regard. The episode for more or less it's just a spoof on H.P. Lovecraft and the various monsters he has created in his Lovecraftian mythology and stuff like that. So it kind of makes fun of that and centers the mystery around it. But the episode actually opens up with a couple of kids, a couple of college students at Darrow University, which winds up being the main setting for the episode. But the kids at Darrow University are reading the Shrieking Madness of Char Gar Gothakon and of the Beast That Hath No Name, which is a book actually created by the in-universe professor Haycraft, who is not so subtle, who is obviously our stand-in for H.P. Lovecraft, and in one particular student actually winds up calling them out for it, pointing out that as he points out, as he states, Char Gar Gothakon is kind of stupid and a bit redundant. Pointing out that obviously Char Gar Gothakon, the beast who has no name. The title itself makes no sense. First and foremost, you could probably figure that out. But he also points out that it isn't even quality literature, with several of the students objecting, pointing out that Haycraft is actually really good at writing. Is actually a really good horror novelist, and that supposedly he gets his information. His stories are actually interpretations of ancient texts. But what we do find out is that the kid who's kind of calling them out is actually a big Harlan Ellison fan, who points out that he's actually that when Harlan Ellison actually winds up making his lecture in a couple of days, in this coming tomorrow, they'll actually wind up singing a completely different tune, and with that he just kind of leaves, once again deriding the fact that deriding Haycraft's work about how his stories don't make any sense, and how the title doesn't make any sense, and how his writing isn't very good, and a whole bunch of other things similar to that. But as he's actually leaving to get ready to go to his car, he actually winds up being attacked by Char Gar Gothakon itself. It's very subtle, but what we do find out is that Char Gar Gothakon actually winds up showing up around the campus, and this winds up becoming a recurring thing. And it immediately attacks the student. Apparently, it doesn't like the fact that it's been called out for basically being called terrible, but. But basically the creature is presumably real. It winds up using its signature shrieking voice to kind of disorient the student and send him flying, and then it proceeds to attack him, and then he kind of just disappears, and nobody's ever hears from him since. But in any case, the episode then continues onward with with Mystery Inc. gang actually arriving at the campus for various reasons, all dropped off by their parents. So Fred is actually among the first to actually arrive. He shows up. He shows up and points out that it's been a little bit awkward since the gang, and specifically Daphne and Velma, specifically Velma and Shaggy broke up. Now that's a completely different little headcanon there. But Fred Jones Sr. merely reassures him, pointing out that it's probably for the best, and in the meantime tells him to actually go check out his old fraternity, and that all he really needs to do is drop his name, and then it doesn't really matter if he talks traps or not. They'll probably let him in by reputation alone. And with that, he then proceeds to get ready to drive off, and then Daphne actually winds up being chauffeured there by their parents' butler, and her parents are actually sitting in the back seat with her, and reassure her that Darrow University is actually a prestigious school that apparently all of the Blakes have since gone to, and Daphne isn't entirely sure if she wants to go to Darrow University, pointing out that it may not be good enough for her, that it may not be right for her, but her parents merely reassure her that that it was good for all the other Blake girls and that it's probably fine. And then they also kind of jokingly chat about maybe they were better off having a boy instead, and tell her to go check out the building they bought, and with that they proceed to drive off as well. And meanwhile, we find out that Velma is actually a big Harlan Ellison fan, and we also find out from that, as a little exchange as well, that Mrs. Dinkley apparently knew Harlan Ellison back in the day, and they actually both attended Darrow University together. And when Velma actually proceeds to go off to the lecture that Ellison is actually giving, tells her her old friend, what is it? I forget the nickname that she calls herself, but basically to just tell her that Mrs. Dinkley says hi, and with that she proceeds to draw by. Meanwhile, Mr. Rogers, he drops off Shaggy and Scooby, who are mainly there for the diner. I should mention, they point out that Darrow University has one of the best diners around, and they can't wait to check it out. And obviously, Mr. Rogers is very embarrassed on behalf of his son and his dog, and merely tells him to just not say what his last name is, and then proceeds to just drive off embarrassedly. At which point, all the gang all realize that they've been dropped off at roughly the same curb, and after a brief, awkward silence, they all just go their separate ways, though Shaggy just kind of makes a motion like he wants the gang to get back together again. But, yeah, the gang just kind of walks off awkwardly and go about their separate ways, and obviously go to all the different locations that they're supposed to be at. And obviously, Fred goes immediately to the fraternity and introduces himself as Fred Jones Sr.'s son, and the guy there, I believe his name is Danny. He welcomes Fred into the fraternity with open arms, and at which point they proceed to exchange stories about how his dad was a legend back in the day. Pointing out supposedly he ate a bear once, but which is an interesting image in and of itself, and I think that's just one of the funniest things ever. But in any case, when Fred then proceeds to ask them what they do in their spare time, and even casually bringing up that he likes to build traps, but and at which point the rest of the fraternity actually brings up that there's only one thing that guys with muscles do, and that's wrestle. And with that, they then proceed to get into a bit of a wrestling match, and Fred winds up joining in. Meanwhile, Daphne winds up going to the building that the Blakes actually bought, and appropriately called the Blake building for self-named buildings, which is really, really funny. But she goes inside, has a bit of a look around, and immediately joins a protest led by a man named Ernesto, which, although she doesn't really understand what exactly it is they're protesting, they're just protesting something. It's not clear what they're protesting, just something. Anything. That's literally the joke. Literally anything they're willing to protest. But, meanwhile, Shaggy and Scooby actually wind up at the diner, and after pointing out how happy they are to be there, they then proceed to order what they state is likely the best thing on the menu. And sure enough, the waitress actually comes back with 2 burgers, which they immediately start chowing down on. But then become visibly more disgusted the more they eat, and then point out that they don't taste like burgers. And sure enough, the waitress points out that they actually had a change in management last week, and because of that, their entire menu is now vegan, and so no burgers for Shaggy and Scooby. And of course they're immediately disappointed and actually spit out the now chewed up vegetables in their mouth. So yeah, kind of disgusting overall. But in any case, the last one and the most important part of this episode, and easily the most important part of the episode, segment of this, is that Velma actually winds up going into a lecture with Harlan Ellison, and what we find out is that Ellison has some very interesting views about literature. First and foremost, he claims that literature hasn't been great in years, which is kind of a little. And also, I should mention he bookends his lecture with that, which sounds interesting. But In any case, after he's done with his lecture, he actually decides to open up with open it up questions to the audience, and it's at this point where one of the students, a student named Howard E. Roberts, who I should mention is actually named after H.P. Lovecraft's real life friend Robert E. Howard. Is because again, this entire episode spoofs H.P. Lovecraft. Case in point, Char Gar Gothakon, very much a spoof of Lovecraft's most famous monster. I should mention that. I haven't brought that up yet, but obviously Char Gar Gothakon, the main villain of the episode, very much a spoof of Cthulhu and also Mind Flayers from Dungeons and Dragons, which in and of themselves were indirectly referenced from Lovecraft. But yeah. In any case, he then proceeds to get. But in any case, Howard, with that little segue aside, Howard then proceeds to get up and asks Ellison how he thinks his work actually compares to Hatecraft's, and Ellison gives a pretty straightforward answer. He points out that he finds, as he puts it, he finds Hatecraft to be an interesting scribbler, but a very minor writer at present, and which Howard takes offense to and proceeds to point out that Hatecraft is actually a very brilliant writer, and that he's wrong, and points out that his writings are actually inspired by actual mythology. Which sure enough, Ellison very much takes offense toward in turn, pointing out that that's dishonest. And that's at worst he's doing it knowingly to write novels, and at best he's ignorant of what he's actually doing and actually does believe the monsters are real. But he does point out that that's a bit preposterous of a claim, and kind of dismisses Howard after that, and proceeds to get into a book signing, with Howard just kind of leaving a little bit half-heartedly, especially after being left out of the auditorium because Ellison is very much a very deridable person and very much a very much acclaimed author. So obviously everybody just kind of goes along with what he says. Everybody just kind of goes along with his jokes and jives at Hatecraft's writing. But in case once all of that actually happens, Velma actually then proceeds to bring down her books, all of her Harlan Ellison books, which she's initially perturbed by, pointing out that he can only write so fast, and also is a little disturbed by the fact and is also initially very off-put by Velma, but with how friendly she is toward him, when she even goes so far as to shake his hand without his consent, and obviously he feels like she's invading his privacy a little bit, but then she introduces herself, and after finding out that Velma Dinkley is actually the kid of an old friend, he starts singing a completely different tune. He does a full 180 and is actually very welcoming toward Velma, pointing out that his mom and Ellison go way back, and pointing out that at one point she made him chicken soup when he was feeling ill. And they kind of have been fast friends ever since. So, and then he merely tells her to go to wish. He basically just tells Velma to wish her mother his best, and also give her a kiss from him. And very excitedly she exclaims at Jinkies, and then thanks him for his time, and then proceeds to walk out of the auditorium with him exclaiming after her to remember that Jinkies isn't actually a real word, which it isn't. It's kind of like in an Urban Dictionary thing, but Jinkies very much a Velma's version of oh my or wow, and a bunch of several other different phrases like that. But it's not actually a real phrase, but it's it in a sense become a real actual word. But I think, but the word itself is made up, and that's its intended meaning. But in any case, after all of that, the gang then proceeds to just kind of hang out for the rest of the day while Ellison gets ready to get into his car and get ready to leave after his lecture. Pointing out that he also again mumbling under his breath about the works of Hatecraft, and about how he feels that he once again points out that Hatecraft might be very dishonest in the way he's actually marketing his books. But as he gets ready to get into the car, he's actually winds up being attacked by Char Gar Gothakon, who who actually winds up assaulting him and actually winds up wrapping him in his tentacles and basically tries to attack him before he can actually get to his car. At which point the rest of the Mystery Inc. actually winds up hearing him scream for help. And they immediately drop everything they're doing in all of their respective B plots and proceed to immediately get together to try and save Ellison. While initially they're not the most cooperative, they do eventually decide to actually work together and scare off the monster, which winds up working. They actually wind up saving Ellison, and the monster proceeds to flee after realizing it can't capture Ellison, and proceeds to actually wind up running off. And Ellison and obviously Velma's the first one to actually consult Ellison, asking him what went wrong, and he he uses a lot of very smart sounding words, but basically he just points out that he was fine and that he was just accosted by a monster from a fictional book. And when Shaggy points out how similar sounding all of the smart words he used are, Ellison then proceeds to do what is probably the funniest moment of this episode, where he roasts Shaggy for his improper use of the word "like," and then leaves. It is probably one of the greatest sequences in this episode. Literally, he just starts using like improperly in his sentences on purpose. Just kind of replacing random words with it, and then proceeds to just leave. It's probably one of the greatest roasts in cartoons, but it's great. But in any case, once he leaves, the rest of the gang then proceeds to wonder what got his panties in a bunch, basically. At which point Daphne actually discovers that there's actually a book lying on the ground. There's actually a bit of a book lying on the ground, and what they find out is that it's actually Haycraft's book on Char Gar Gothakon. Obviously, Char Gar Gothakon, the beast that has no name. Obviously, they find out that it's a little bit strange that the monster actually was carrying a book of itself, about itself, and more strangely, they also note that there's a very strange smell that Daphne also notes. Daphne kind of points out that it's like gargled clams or something like that, but notably, it's a very strange smell and a very stinky smell, and one that they can't really fully describe. But in case, Velma then proceeds. Velma realizing that they actually have a bit of a lead about what's going on, and noting that Haycraft seemingly has brought his monster to life to terrorize students. Immediately goes to his mansion, which is on school grounds, to actually go and get some answers. And sure enough, they immediately go into Haycraft's house, and it's basically his mansion. It's very much covered in memorabilia of all of the monsters that he's created for his stories. And they're all references to various Lovecraftian monsters, which I think is kind of great. Yeah, he just kind of really commits to the bit. I do kind of appreciate it for that. It's a very fun scene. But in case as they're going through, they also note that the house is very dusty, and Shaggy points out that the guy could have at least afforded a maid. But then he runs face first into a gorgon, and he and Scooby proceed to freak out and trip and fall. With Velma just kind of pointing out how stupid they are, pointing out that it's just a statue from one of his books, and they do eventually find Haycraft in his study. He's watching a news thing about how the Darrow the Darrow family treasure has recently been stolen. But then he turns off the news as soon as they come in. At which point the gang then proceed to greet him, and he greets them in turn. And the way he talks suggests that he may have in fact seen some of the monsters that he's quote unquote imagined. He's a very interesting outlook on things, and often invokes the names of the various monsters he's supposedly created, almost as if they're real. And Shaggy even notes that as well, pointing out that that's a very strange thing. But Velma then proceeds to confront Haycraft, pointing out the monsters and pointing out the creation of his monsters, and that they're actually fictional books. But he merely reassures them that they're in fact very real, and then gestures to the massive collection in his study, pointing out that his job is to kind of go pour through all the various tomes in his study that are actually alphabetized by his student assistant, and he points out that his job is to just pour through them and reinterpret them in his books. Basically, that's basically how he describes himself. At which point, Shaggy helps himself to one of the books, in which Haycraft is initially very angry with, but then he finds out it's literally just fan mail and lets Shaggy just go at it. At which point Velma actually winds up taking the book full of fan mail letters from Shaggy, and notes that the handwriting in a lot of the pages are very similar, and Haycraft merely just chalks it up to his dedicated fans, and proceeds to just kind of go back to watching his news story and dismissing them, pointing out that if that's all the questions they had, that they're more than welcome to leave. And sure enough, they don't have any other questions, so they just kind of walk out, at which point Shred suggests that they get back together and actually solve the mystery, but everybody just kind of walks off awkwardly, and he decides to drop it entirely. At which point they go back to their business around campus. Velma actually winds up going into the campus burger stand to actually read. And she actually winds up going to a campus diner, which Scooby and Shaggy actually wind up joining her shortly after. Not together, mind you. They're just, they show up individually and just wind up hanging out briefly. But the reason Scooby and Shaggy are there is that as they mentioned, as it turns out, there isn't another place to get food for miles, and they're hungry. They haven't eaten in a while, so they figure vegetables is better than nothing. And with that, they then get a table as far away from Velma to actually go and get order some food, while Fred actually winds up walking in, and with his newfound campus buddies, but he merely when Velma asks him if he's willing to join them as well, he merely points out that he's not really at the point for to eat, and that he just wanted to introduce her to his new fraternity buddies, pointing out that they're all pretty great and that they're kind of like his new brothers, and sure enough, they're kind of like a gang of 5 again, but he points out that that his new gang is actually going to teach him a new move afterward, which basically just amounts to him wearing a blindfold and being dumped in tapioca, which he doesn't really understand why that's a wrestling move, but he points out he doesn't really have any objections to it, and he leaves with his new buddies. And with that, they then proceed to start with in any case with that. Shaggy and Scooby-Doo eventually get their food, but then at that exact moment, Char Gar Gothakon actually winds up barging into the place and actually winds up going on a rampage and attacking everybody. And Scooby and Shaggy immediately flee and also scoop up Velma in the process, with Velma pointing out that she hasn't quite forgiven them, but she does thank them for saving her life, at which point they proceed to continue fleeing through the campus to try and get the rest of their friends. Of course, they wind up picking up Fred, who is about to be dunked in a thing of tapioca, which is a really funny visual, but they scoop him up and run off, while Daphne is actually in the middle of yet another protest with Ernesto, the guy that once again is leading the protest in the first place, pointing out that they're still going down the list of protestables to try and find another thing to protest now that they've successfully protested the thing that they were protesting before, with obviously one of the things on there, well, not so obviously, but one of the things on there is a really fine thing, is old man smell. It was old person smell, which Daphne isn't entirely sure if they can protest, but Ernesto merely points out that they don't know if unless they try. At which point the rest of the gang come in and scoop her up and immediately run for the parking lot, where they actually wind up tripping over HP Haycraft, who was spying on them. And they wind up tripping over him, and obviously Velma calls him out for spying, which he obviously doesn't even begin to deny, and he reveals that the reason he was spying on everybody was to confirm whether or not Char Gar Gothakon was actually rampaging around campus, and now that he has indeed confirmed that what they were saying is the truth about the Char Gar Gothakon attacks, he then decides that now that he knows the truth, he decides that now it's time to actually spread the truth about Char Gar Gothakon, and sure enough, he then proceeds to gather up the entire campus in a lecture hall, or at least all the members of campus who are actually fans of his, and proceeds to tell everybody that Char Gar Gothakon is a fictional character in a horror novel that he made. basically he just explains how Char Gar Gothakon isn't real. Stop worshiping him like he's actually a god, and that he merely made him up as a fictional character in a story to sell books. That is it. That is the entirety of Char Gar Gothakon's lore summarized. And it does kind of mirror the whole Lovecraftian thing as well. Whereas they were just kind of stories that Lovecraft made up, and they're not really real ancient deities or anything like that. They just exist. They're just fictional monsters. They're not real. But yeah, obviously Howard is the first one to actually speak up, pointing out that that can't actually be true, and is wondering who is making Hatecraft say things like that, and he merely demands that it's the truth, and tells them to stop, and tells them that it is the truth that Char Gar Gothakon isn't a real monster. At which point Ernesto and his gang of protesters actually walk in, pointing out that to stop listening to them, and to Hatecraft to start listening to him. To him, and then they sing a song about Char Gar Gothakon and basically Eldritch deity rights. That is basically what the song is about. Which it's not really a very long song, but it's a very funny one. And after seeing this whole display, Shaggy concludes that nobody is going to actually listen to them, and wonders what they do, and wonders aloud what they are actually supposed to do now. And at which point Fred decides that they do what they always do, which is to set a trap and catch the monster in the act. But he does point out that he can't actually do it himself, and that he'll need their help to actually do it, and wonders if they'll actually join him for old time's sake. And they don't initially give an answer. But they don't really have time to actually, but because right at that moment the power starts going out, and Char Gar Gothakon actually winds up bursting into the lecture hall, and proceeds to not only attack several of the students in the process with its sonic scream, but proceeds to scoop up Hatecraft and flee with him, and flee back to Hatecraft's mansion. And the rest of the gang proceed to follow Hatecraft and Char Gar Gothakon inside, and try to go find out where he is. And not really sure where his screams for help are actually coming from. They decide to actually split up, ironically enough, leaving Shaggy alone by himself, which he points out isn't cool. But in the process, the gang actually winds up mostly reconciling. Fred and Daphne actually wind up splitting up, and with Fred remarking all of the cool trinkets that Hatecraft has on his walls, and starts examining them, and points out that he can't wait to have all of these things when he's old like Hatecraft, but as he puts it. At which point, Daphne actually winds up handing him a hook that she found, which he points out might actually be good for building a trap, and he points out that that's actually a pretty good find, and actually thanks her, and she points out that it's probably because they think so alike and are actually very in sync, and to actually test that theory, Fred actually winds up asking her to ask what he's thinking, and she asks if he's thinking about her, but he merely points out that he just cleared his mind and wasn't thinking of anything, but points out that was actually a pretty good guess. And she kind of sighs, pointing out that it was indeed a good guess, and they then kind of just go about their business to try and go find Hatecraft. Meanwhile, Velma and Scooby actually wind up together, and Velma notes that they seem to have gotten separated from Shaggy, and is worried about what might have happened to him. And Scooby, noting that she's worried, actually asks her why she's so worried about him, and she merely points out that regardless of whether or not they broke up or not, she does still care for him, and she's still very much part of him, and points out that she'll probably love him forever, even if he did leave her for Scooby, and he then decides to just kind of comfort her, pointing out and kind of apologizes on Shaggy's behalf. At which point the two groups actually hear Shaggy screaming, and they proceed to immediately run back to back to where they hear Shaggy, where they discover that Shaggy has since started cowering behind a flower pot, because as he puts it, he felt something very tentacle-like brush up against his shoulder, and he panicked. At which point he gestures to where he actually felt the tentacle, and Fred then proceeds to actually go and investigate, and quickly discovers that what he actually felt was actually a backpack strap, and notes some very strange things in it. Namely that has a book of H.P. Haycraft in it, from H.P. Haycraft's books in it, and also the handwriting inside the book actually matches the ones that they found the ones they actually found in Haycraft's room. And notably, it has a very straight. The backpack has a very disgusting smell to it, akin to the actual monster. At which point they hear somebody hollering at them from the closet, and Fred tries to unlock the door, but when that doesn't work, he actually winds up shoulder checking it. Which winds up freeing the freckled student from earlier, the one that was denouncing Haycraft and denouncing his works of his books as being terrible. He points out that it turns out Char Gar Gothakon actually wound up bringing him back to the mansion and stuffed him in a room full of Haycraft's books, and he's been forced to read them to pass the time, and which he points out wasn't pleasant. At which point they then proceed to actually hear Haycraft hollering from what is seemingly the roof of the mansion, and the gang then proceeds to go up to the roof to actually go and investigate. And sure enough, they discover that Char Gar Gothakon is about to throw his creator off the roof, and they quickly realize they need to do something to save Haycraft, or he's going to go off the roof, and Char Gar Gothakon is going to kill his own creator. At which point Velma points out that Char Gar Gothakon, and by extension all the other monsters that Haycraft has created, all respond to chanting, and they decide to actually kind of do a bit of a pincer technique where Shaggy and Scooby are going to sneak up behind the monster and tackle it, while the rest of the gang actually winds up distracting it with its chanting, and it works. The monster doesn't initially know what to do because Fred, Daphne, and Velma are actually chanting at it, but it realizes too late that Shaggy and Scooby are behind it, and he's too busy trying to deal with the rest of the gang to actually notice that Shaggy and Scooby are there. And sure enough, it tackles him, and he loses his balance. And Haycraft almost goes off the roof, but Shaggy and Scooby catch him, and then Char Gar Gothakon winds up going off the roof, in the process letting out an involuntary cry for help, and Haycraft winds up catching it. At which point they pull Char Gar Gothakon to safety, with Shaggy pointing out that's very strange for an eldritch deity to be calling for help. At which point Char Gar Gothakon just tries to release another one of Sonic screams, but Fred winds up gagging it with his ascot to keep it from screaming, at which point they then proceed to unmask it to reveal that it's actually Howard. As we find out, Howard is indeed Haycraft's student assistant. As we find out, as it has been implied in the episode, he's a little obsessed with Haycraft. Obviously he's a little obsessed with Haycraft and Char Gar Gothakon, and decided to actually get revenge against everybody by making Char Gar Gothakon real. By case in point, by making his own costume, complete with a Sonic Scream that he apparently picked up in college because that was his major. He kind of studied tech and Sonics and a whole bunch of other related fields, but he does point out that, and then he also reveals that the main source of the awful smell that everybody has been smelling was actually the costume itself. As it turns out, he made the costume using actual octopus tentacles, which he later admits that he actually regrets because they actually smell terrible while he's wearing the costume. And the Mystery Inc. gang, realizing they finally placed what the awful smell was, but finally have a moment of recollection when they finally are able to place it. Obviously they point out that when H.P. Haycraft actually wound up denouncing Char Gar Gothakon as mere fiction, that caused Howard to snap and go after Haycraft as well, since according to him, Char Gar Gothakon is very real and very much something that Haycraft has put a lot of effort into making. So when Haycraft kind of just announced his own creation, it kind of sent Howard off the deep end. But they then proceed to actually but in any case, with that, the police then proceed to scoop Howard up. At which point Harlan Ellison actually shows up to check on Haycraft, having apparently been in the lecture that Haycraft gave where he denounced his creation, and apparently has kind of reconciled with him on that front. And when he asks him what happened and what was going on, Haycraft merely tells him that it was just a crazy fan who took things a little too far. And at which point Ellison kind of concurs with him, pointing out that overzealous fans are kind of the worst, And they then decide to go into business together and make a book about it. And then proceed to go into Haycraft's book to bring into Haycraft's mansion to brainstorm some ideas. Although they kind of sort of don't really agree about how to actually name the book. Specifically, that he wants to get that Harlan Ellison points out that Haycraft has gone back to his old tricks of naming a monster and then claiming it has no name. Which with Haycraft just kind of telling him not to push it. But in case, with that, Mystery Inc. is now formally back together, and they then proceed to get back into the Mystery Machine, pointing out that now that everything is back to normal, they can now go back to solving mysteries the way they used to be. And obviously Fred is very proud of the fact that they managed to reconcile, and points out that now that they're kind of back to normal, he's very proud to just be back to. He's just very proud that the gang got back together, and he didn't think they actually would. But now that they've actually reconciled their differences and worked everything out, the gang is now stronger than ever, as he puts it. But then he winds up opening the bed of the Mystery Machine, where they discover the Darrow family chest, which they do remark they remember was stolen from the news article that Haycraft was watching. And as we find out, Mr. E is the one who stole it. He actually leaves them various clues regarding the history of Crystal Cove inside the chest, and they then proceeds to point out that the first Mystery Inc. might not have disappeared if they had actually had this. And sure enough, when they go through it, they do find out that it is indeed the entire history of Crystal Cove, and they then point out that it seems like this might be actually be connected to their mystery, and as Velma puts it, their one mystery has now become two. This episode is obviously very interesting for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it seems to imply that Mr. E isn't afraid to do some unsportsmanlike things to get Mystery Inc. on the track of actually finding their predecessors. Case in point, he steals an archive full of Crystal Cove history and just kind of leaves it in the Mystery Machine, and they just kind of find it. I should emphasize that he steals it. He just straight up steals something of historical significance to give as a gift. He's clearly not very concerned with laws and breaking them or anything. He literally just gives them a clue at the expense of the law, which doesn't sound legal at all. But it actually probably isn't. But it definitely isn't now that I'm thinking about it. But more to the point, as I've stated several times in this episode in general is just a spoof of H.P. Lovecraft, and I kind of love it for that reason. First and foremost, you got H.P. Lovecraft himself, who is replaced by H.P. Haycraft, but then you have his Howard H. Roberts, who I should mention is actually named after Robert H. Howards, who is a close friend of Lovecraft. And obviously in the episode, he is indeed the student assistant and is a little obsessed with Haycraft. And then there's also the fact that Haycraft himself is actually voiced by a famous actor from several Lovecraftian adaptations. Basically, this guy has appeared in a lot of horror movies, and several of them have been based on Lovecraft's works. So. Yeah, they really commit to the bit with this one. They go the full 9 yards with this. And then obviously there's the titular monster, Char Gar Gothakon, which is very much based on Cthulhu and also Mind Flayers from Dungeons and Dragons, which in and of themselves were based off of Cthulhu. Well, not directly, but they are based on a book that was based on Cthulhu. So. Yeah, there's a bit of a loose tangent there, but it is interesting nonetheless. But yeah, I do like this episode for that reason. It very much spoofs H.P. Lovecraft, and I kind of love it. But yeah, this episode also kind of continues the ongoing narrative where Mystery Inc. is now back together again after having a bit of a brief breakup from each other, and now they're back on track to actually solving the central mystery of Crystal Cove, and which seems to now be centered on the whole entire history of it and all the strange happenings that have been going on there. So yeah, there seems to be some sort of connection there, and I'm interested to see what kind of thing is actually going to go on with that. But yeah, I do think I'm gonna leave this episode here, but I did like this episode. I very much liked reviewing it, and it's a very interesting episode overall. I do like it, and it is definitely one of my favorites so far. I mean, there's probably gonna be another one that's gonna be one of my new favorites, but yeah, just go check that. But yeah, it's also on HBO Max, so if you have an HBO Max account now, you can go check that out, which I'm gonna be doing from this point forward. But in any case, yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It does really help me out, and you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks that I'm always saying thanks. So be sure to check those out. Link is down in the description. And finally, if you want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out check out my Twitch down in the description. We're actually going to be streaming Pokemon Legends Arceus in the coming future. So if you want to absolutely see that, by all means, go check that out. We're going to be streaming that over there. And I'm very much looking forward to streaming Legends Arceus because it's basically Pokemon Monster Hunter, and I kind of like that little mashup of ideas. This is gonna be like this new take on what Pokemon is made by Game Freak. It's gonna be interesting, but yeah, go check that out. And also be sure to check out my videos linked in the end screen as well. Top videos is the most recent one. It may or may not be this one. For some Bob video is the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you want to try something new or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, we'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.